In Manhattan's winter of 1881, the chandeliers of a Fifth Avenue mansion burn like captured stars. Beneath them, a veiled widow glides through a sea of whispers, grief polished into etiquette, love buried under duty. Then a stranger's nocturne breaks the air, a pianist with humble hands and a dangerous gift, one melody and the room holds its breath. Is it solace or scandal? A secret trembles behind velvet curtains, a past knocks at the door, and a choice sharpens, obedience to a name or surrender to the heart. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from, and one question for you. In historical romances, do you prefer love that defies society, or love that redeems it? Manhattan, New York City, winter of 1881. The snow fell softly over Fifth Avenue, cloaking the city in a hush of elegance and secrecy. Carriages lined the street outside the Van Alen mansion, their brass lanterns glowing like watchful eyes beneath the gas lamps. Inside, 1,000 candles flickered from crystal sconces and chandeliers, casting golden light over the velvet-draped walls and marble columns of the grand ballroom. The scent of beeswax, jasmine perfume, and chilled champagne wove together in the air, as New York's most distinguished guests sipped, laughed, and whispered. Beatrice Van Alen stood at the top of the staircase, regal in her mourning. At 40 years old, she had become a figure of myth, the widow of Horace Van Alen, railroad tycoon and titan of the age. Draped in a gown of deep sapphire silk, its bodice embroidered with black jet and Chantilly lace, she looked every bit the untouchable queen of her late husband's empire. Her auburn hair was arranged in perfect coils, not a single pin out of place, and a diamond hairpin gleamed like a secret above her left ear. Around her throat, a black velvet ribbon bore a cameo of her husband's profile, a symbol of loyalty, or perhaps of chains. She descended slowly, the soft rustle of her train trailing behind her like a hush as the crowd turned. There was always a moment, a pause in conversation, a tilt of glasses not yet sipped, when Beatrice entered a room. She moved through the sea of guests with practiced ease, offering a nod here, a faint smile there, her voice no louder than silk drawn across skin. She belonged to no one, and everyone knew it. Tonight marked her 4th charity gala since Horace's death. Though she no longer wore full mourning, the grey gloves at her elbows and the shadowed embroidery on her bodice reminded the world that her heart, at least publicly, had not yet awakened. The orchestra played Strauss and Gounod as ladies in rustling taffeta and men in stiff white ties waltzed beneath garlands of holly and winter roses. Beatrice stood near the fireplace, accepting compliments for the evening's arrangements, while her mind wandered, as it often did, to the silence that awaited her upstairs. These nights, though glittering, ended in solitude. Her fingers twitched softly beneath her gloves, aching to touch the keys of the piano no one had played since Horace's passing. Then, quite without ceremony, the music stopped. A ripple of confusion passed through the ballroom. The conductor, a portly man with greying whiskers, stepped forward and gestured toward the grand piano at the far end of the room. A solitary figure approached, tall, lean, dressed in black. He bowed modestly to the crowd before taking his seat. His name, Beatrice vaguely recalled, was Julian Hart, a pianist of some quiet renown among bohemian circles, invited by the event's co-chair, Mrs. Pembroke of Boston. He was not one of their own. He began to play. It was not the familiar waltz of polite society, nor the triumphant fanfare of well-known composers. His fingers summoned a nocturne that unfolded like confession, tentative, intimate, achingly tender. The room fell silent. Even the chandeliers seemed to still. Beatrice froze. She had heard every sort of performance across decades of galas, soirees, and diplomatic dinners. But this was something else. This music did not aim to impress. It was not composed for applause. It was music that wept, that reached inward, that lingered where the heart had forgotten how to feel. Her breath caught. For one suspended moment, she forgot where she was, who she was. Her eyes searched the man at the piano. He played with his head bowed slightly, as if the notes rose not from the keys, but from something carved into his ribs. His profile revealed a strong jaw, dark curls brushing his collar, and a quiet tension across his brow, as though each note cost him something. She took a step forward, unconsciously, before catching herself. The crowd remained silent as the final chord faded into the winter night. Then came the applause, scattered at first, then rising like a storm. Guests praised the novelty of the piece, the raw brilliance of it, before returning to their drinks. The orchestra resumed its waltz. Beatrice did not move. She stood near the column beside the grand piano, hidden in the play of shadows and lamplight, watching Julian Hart rise. He nodded politely to the conductor and stepped back into the quiet corner from which he had come. No fanfare, no smugness, just silence. Mrs. Lennox appeared at her side, hands folded, her expression as calm and perceptive as ever. "Shall I have the fire in your rooms lit, madam?" Beatrice did not answer at first. Her eyes remained fixed on the now empty piano bench. "Yes," she said at last, "and ask Mr. Lennox to ensure the piano in the music room is tuned." The housekeeper tilted her head. "Of course, madam." As guests began to bid their farewells and laughter returned to the halls, Beatrice ascended the staircase once more, her sapphire skirts whispering along the steps. She did not look back. But as she reached the landing and turned down the corridor toward her rooms, her hand brushed the carved banister with absent fingers, as if the wood itself had changed beneath her touch. Behind her, the final chords of Julian Hart's Nocturne still echoed in her mind. And for the first time in many, many winters, Beatrice Van Alen did not dread the silence that awaited her. She welcomed it, because within it music remained. The frost had deepened by the time February arrived in Manhattan, turning the panes of the Van Alen mansion into delicate tapestries of ice. Fifth Avenue remained pristine under a blanket of snow, the carriages now fewer, the silence heavier. Winter lingered like an unwanted guest, yet inside the grand house something had begun to stir, something small, unseen, but impossible to ignore. Beatrice Van Alen sat in her private study as early morning light filtered through the lace curtains. The fire was low but steady, casting soft glows over the velvet armchair, the bookshelves trimmed in mahogany, and the polished floor beneath her slippers. Her tea sat untouched. Her thoughts were elsewhere, far from the rituals that governed her days. The music still lived inside her. She had not spoken his name, not to Mrs. Lennox, not even to herself. But since the gala, since that haunting performance that shattered something long entombed in her chest, she had thought of Julian Hart more times than she cared to admit. He was not like the men she had known. There was no arrogance, no need to conquer. Only honesty, raw, unvarnished, in the way his hands moved over the piano, in the way his silence said more than words could. It had been nearly a week. She rose from the armchair and moved with quiet purpose toward the escritoire, where she kept her private stationery. The desk had belonged to her mother. Its drawers still smelled faintly of violets and aged paper. She selected a pale ivory card bordered in silver and wrote with a hand that barely trembled. "Mr. Julian Hart, would you be amenable to a brief consultation regarding a private musical commission for the upcoming spring benefit? I would prefer discretion. Mrs. Beatrice Van Alen." She sealed the envelope with wax and rang the bell. Mrs. Lennox appeared with the promptness of a well-trained heartbeat. Her expression, as always, was one of composed attentiveness. Beatrice handed her the letter without explanation. "To be delivered by footman. No reply is necessary." The housekeeper accepted it with a faint nod. "Shall I inform Mr. Van Alen of the spring benefit preparations?" Beatrice's gaze shifted slightly. "No, not yet." Henry had grown more present since the gala, appearing in the drawing room unannounced, offering advice she had not requested. commenting on her choice of books and dinner guests with that paternal tone he assumed whenever he remembered she was a widow under his protection. There was no doubt he had noticed the change in her posture, the new brightness in her eye, and he would not like it. But she did not care, not today. 3 days later, Beatrice waited in the music room, a smaller, more intimate chamber off the eastern wing of the mansion. The walls were papered in dusky rose, the mouldings painted a soft cream. An oval rug covered the parquet floor, and at the room's centre stood a grand piano of black walnut, untouched for years. The space was warm, despite the season, and quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the ormolu clock on the mantel. She wore a tea-gown of pale lilac silk, unstructured and flowing, her corset absent. Her hair, though still styled with precision, was softer today, looser. A single pearl pendant lay just above the hollow of her throat. She stood near the window, one hand resting on the curtain, the other hidden within her sleeve. When the footman announced Julian, she did not turn immediately. She let the silence stretch, tasting its tension, feeling it settle like snow between them. "Thank you for coming," she said at last, her voice calm and without adornment. Julian bowed as he entered, his coat slightly damp from the snow. He looked different here, not small, not out of place, but real. The contrast between the ornate room and his modest clothing was stark, but not unbecoming. He removed his gloves with care and stepped forward. "You honor me, Mrs. Van Alen," he replied, his voice low, sincere. "I confess I was surprised." She turned then, and their eyes met. There was no music, no candles, no crowd, only the echo of what had been shared without words. "I've asked you here to consider a commission," she said, moving toward the piano. "A new piece, something original. I would like it to debut at my spring benefit." Julian hesitated. "May I ask what sort of piece you envision?" Beatrice placed her hand lightly on the piano's surface. "Not something grand, not for an orchestra." Her fingers drifted toward the keys but did not press. "Something intimate, for this room." Julian stepped closer. "A duet." A pause. She sat on the bench and touched one note, a single delicate G. It echoed through the room like breath. "I no longer play," she murmured. "That was not playing," he answered gently, sitting beside her. "That was remembering." She looked down at the keys, her hands still. "I used to play before I became a wife, before I became what was expected." He said nothing. He did not need to. His presence was enough, a steady current beneath the silence. After a moment, Beatrice lifted both hands and placed them on the keys. Slowly, without confidence but with longing, she played the first bars of a childhood etude. The notes wavered, uneven but tender. Julian did not interrupt. He watched her, not with hunger, not with pity, but with reverence. When she faltered, he reached over and filled in the notes. Their hands brushed, but neither pulled away. The melody continued haltingly until it dissolved into stillness. Beatrice turned her face slightly, just enough to see him in profile. His expression was thoughtful, touched by something deeper than admiration. "I am out of practice," she whispered. "You are not," he said. "You are simply unheard." A shiver passed through her. She stood abruptly, moving toward the window to gather herself. Outside, the snow had begun again, fine and relentless. "You must think me a fool," she said. "No," Julian replied. "I think you are beginning to breathe." Silence followed, taut and luminous. Beatrice closed her eyes. The fire crackled behind them. The clock ticked, and for a moment, all the rules of their world, all the lines drawn in ash and silver, seemed to vanish. Then a knock sounded. Mrs. Lennox entered, composed as ever. "Mr. Henry Van Alen is in the drawing-room, madam. He insists on seeing you." Beatrice's spine straightened. The name struck the room like a gust of cold wind. Julian stood and bowed again. "Thank you for allowing me the honor of this conversation." Beatrice inclined her head, her voice softer now. "Will you return next week?" "If you wish it," he said. "I do." He gave her a final look, quiet, respectful, and charged with something neither of them dared name, and left the room. When he was gone, she placed both hands on the piano lid and closed it slowly, as if sealing something sacred beneath the polished wood. Only then did she turn toward the corridor where Henry waited, where society waited, and step back into the world that demanded silence. But deep within her the music had returned, not as memory, as promise. The days shortened as February waned, and Manhattan lay hushed beneath a sky the color of pewter. Snow, soft as lace and just as intricate, drifted over rooftops, muffling the sharp sounds of the city and transforming the avenues into dreamlike corridors of stillness. Inside the Van Alen mansion, the warmth of the hearths burned steadily, but it was not the fire alone that brought heat to the once frozen halls. Julian Hart had begun to arrive with quiet regularity. He never came through the main entrance. Instead, he was escorted discreetly through the servants' hallway and led to the music room, where the windows overlooked the frost-bitten courtyard garden and the rose-colored wallpaper seemed to glow in the late afternoon light. He brought with him no fanfare, no boasting, only a leather case with scores and a presence that was becoming alarmingly familiar to the rhythm of the house. Beatrice, who had once measured her days by the hours between obligatory visits and solitary meals, now found herself listening for the particular sound of his steps on the wooden floor. There was a cadence to them, confident yet unassuming, and when the door opened to reveal him, always on time, never early, something within her steadied and stirred all at once. They had begun composing together. It was not declared aloud. There had been no formal agreement, no grand announcement of collaboration. One afternoon, he had placed a blank sheet of staff paper before her and asked, without ceremony, "What do you hear when you close your eyes?" She had hesitated, and then, with trembling hands and a heart that beat too loudly in her chest, she had pressed her fingers to the keys and answered. What followed was something slow and unspoken. A melody took shape between them, born of shadows and light. It was a waltz, yes, but not the kind spun in gaslit ballrooms, not the sort that clung to corsets and chandeliers. It was a waltz for a woman who had once lost her voice and for the man who dared to listen. They never named it. Some things defy the boundaries of language. Their sessions stretched longer with each visit. What began as rehearsals dissolved into hours of silence and sound, of glances that hovered just too long, of shoulders brushing when they reached for the same note, of breath shared in pauses between phrases. One particular afternoon, the snow fell in thick, swirling veils outside the window. Inside, the music room was dim, lit only by the fire and the winter light that filtered through gauzy curtains. Julian sat at the piano, his brow slightly furrowed, adjusting the phrasing of a descending scale, while Beatrice paced slowly near the hearth, her gloved hands clasped before her. She wore a deep grey gown that day, simple but finely tailored, with a high collar trimmed in lace. Her hair had been swept into a looser style, though a single wisp of auburn had escaped and now trailed down beside her cheek, unnoticed by her, but not by him. He looked up, the pencil in his hand suspended mid-air. "There's something missing," he murmured, a hesitation, just before the return to the theme. She turned, her expression thoughtful. "Where?" He gestured, and she stepped closer. Without thinking, she sat beside him, their knees nearly touching, the fire behind them warming the air. He played the passage again, and this time she laid her hand on the keys to echo his. In the moment the music paused, the silence between them deepened, not empty, but full. She looked down, and that errant lock of hair fell forward once more, curling gently against her cheek. Julian reached out slowly, reverently. He did not speak. With the back of his fingers, he tucked the strand behind her ear, his hand lingering for the briefest moment against her temple. His touch was feather-light, but it sent a cascade of sensation through her, like stepping barefoot onto snow that had not yet been touched by the world. Her breath caught. She did not move. And he did not apologize. It was the smallest of gestures. In another life, in another room, it would have passed unnoticed. But in Beatrice's world, where every glance was measured, every gesture choreographed, it was nothing short of a rebellion. He lowered his hand and returned to the keys, as if nothing had passed between them, but his voice, when he spoke, was quieter than before. "We'll add 2 measures of rest," he said. "Let the silence say it first." Beatrice nodded. Outside the door, Clara Dempsey stood frozen. The young maid had been sent to collect the laundry from the parlour, but had paused, not out of mischief, but something closer to awe. She had heard the music drifting down the corridor, and it had drawn her like a thread of gold. She did not mean to linger, and yet she had. Clara's heart beat fast in her chest. She had always admired Mrs. Van Alen from a respectful distance, the way one admires a cathedral or a marble statue, beautiful, untouchable, sacred. But what she had just seen was not the frozen face of society's perfect widow. It was something raw, something warm. Clara fled before she could be discovered, but she carried the image with her, the way Julian looked at her mistress, the way Mrs. Van Alen had not looked away. The next morning, as Beatrice sat in her study reviewing invitations for spring events, Mrs. Lennox brought a tray with her usual tea and biscuits, along with a faint arch in her brow. "Clara mentioned Mr. Hart stayed nearly 2 hours yesterday," she said, as she poured the tea. "I trust the composition is progressing." Beatrice did not lift her eyes from the letter in her hand. "It is. And your mood, madam, I dare say it has lightened." There was a pause. Then Beatrice placed the letter aside and took the teacup delicately between her fingers. "Perhaps it is not the music," she said. "Perhaps it is the silence between the notes." Mrs. Lennox inclined her head, saying nothing more. Later that evening, alone in her bedroom, Beatrice opened the drawer beside her bed and took out the sheet music they had begun. No title, no composer's name, just notes on a page, waiting to be heard. She traced one of the pencil markings, a slur connecting 2 soft minor chords. Her fingers ached to play it again. But more than that, her heart ached to feel the quiet weight of his presence beside her as she did. The waltz had no name, but in its notes she had begun to remember who she was before silence became survival. And though she would not say it aloud, not yet, she feared and hoped that Julian Hart was beginning to hear the same truth. It had been one of those evenings when winter crept into the bones without warning. The sky over Manhattan had turned a brittle shade of ash, and the streets glistened with a fine sheen of frost. Though the city's gaslights flickered dutifully and the warmth of drawing rooms promised reprieve, Beatrice Van Alen had chosen solitude over society. She had walked alone beneath the bare branches in the courtyard garden, wrapped in her heaviest velvet cloak, her gloved hands clutching its collar too tightly, as though the cold might strip her of the composure she wore so elegantly. She had not spoken to Julian that day. He had come and gone as he always did, discreet as a shadow, leaving behind unfinished music and a silence thick with what neither dared to name. But something had shifted within her, something delicate, and for reasons she did not fully understand, she needed the air, even if it stung. By the time she returned to the mansion, her breath was ragged, her skin cold despite the heat of the fire waiting upstairs. She said little as Mrs. Lennox helped her remove her gloves and cloak, but the older woman's brow furrowed with concern. "Shall I bring you tea, madam?" the housekeeper asked. "No," Beatrice replied, her voice softer than usual. "I only need a moment to myself." But moments alone can be cruel in a house so large, especially when the body has begun to surrender to something unseen. By midnight, her fever had begun. She did not ring for assistance. Instead, she had made her way to the private sitting room adjacent to her chambers, a quiet refuge of damask drapes, worn poetry volumes, and the warmth of an ever-burning hearth. It was there that Mrs. Lennox found her an hour later, half slumped on the chaise, her complexion too pale, her breathing too shallow. A physician was sent for, but in the meantime there was only one other soul in the house who could be trusted with what could no longer be hidden. Julian Hart had just gathered his coat from the servants' hall when the message reached him. He had not expected to be summoned again that night, but when he was led upstairs, not to the music room, but to her rooms, his pulse beat as if it had been waiting for such a call all along. He entered without ceremony, yet his steps were reverent, cautious. The sitting room was bathed in the amber glow of firelight. Shadows danced along the high walls and curled into the corners like watchful spirits. And there she was, Beatrice, swathed in a heavy robe, her body sunk into the cushions, her eyes closed, her face glistening with the sheen of fever. She looked fragile in a way that struck him like a blow. "Thank you for coming," Mrs. Lennox said, her voice low as she poured water into a basin. "Of course," Julian answered. "What does she need?" "Warmth, liquids, and someone she trusts." Julian did not reply. He simply removed his gloves, rolled up his sleeves and took the cloth from the basin. He knelt beside her and pressed the damp linen to her brow. She stirred, murmuring something too soft to decipher. Her fingers twitched beneath the folds of her robe, and when he gently wrapped one of his hands around hers, she did not pull away. He sat with her for hours. He read from a book of sonnets when she seemed restless. He fed her spoonfuls of broth that Mrs. Lennox had prepared, coaxing her lips to part with patience and quiet persistence, and when the fever peaked and her body shook with the chills that followed, he gathered her hands between his and held them until the tremors stilled. It was near dawn when she began to speak. At first her voice was no more than a whisper, raw and trembling. "I don't remember," she murmured, her eyes half-lidded, fixed not on him, but on some far-away place beyond the flames. "Who I was. Before grief." Julian swallowed, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. "You don't have to," he said softly. "Not tonight." Her breath hitched. Then she looked at him, truly looked, and in her eyes he saw not the poised widow of Fifth Avenue, not the elegant hostess or the benefactress of orphanages, but the woman beneath all of it, a woman worn down by silence, a woman learning to feel again. "I used to laugh," she said. "I remember that." A faint smile touched his lips, aching with restraint. "Then you will again." Their hands remained joined, suspended in a silence heavier than sound. In the firelight, his profile was softened, the harsh lines of his jaw tempered by weariness, by concern, by something deeper that neither of them dared to name. Beatrice's eyelids fluttered. "Will you stay?" she asked, the question no louder than the crackle of the logs. Julian hesitated, not because he didn't want to, but because he did. Because the desire to remain in that room, in that moment, was too strong, too dangerous, too real. He gave a single nod. "I'll stay." She closed her eyes and drifted into sleep. He remained at her side until morning, seated in the armchair with her hand still resting in his. He did not sleep. He watched the flames, their rhythm matching the rise and fall of her breath. He watched the snow begin again beyond the window. And when the first grey light of dawn stretched its fingers across the carpet, he released her hand and stood quietly, aching in places he had never known could ache. He did not notice Mrs. Lennox standing in the doorway. The housekeeper stepped forward, her gaze heavy with understanding and warning. "I know what I saw," she said simply. Julian turned to her. He did not defend himself. She continued, voice low and measured. "She trusts so few, and with reason. But this house has eyes," Julian finished for her. She nodded, "and ears, and mouths eager to speak." He looked back at the woman asleep on the chaise, her hair now loosened across the pillow, her cheeks flushed from fever, not shame. "I won't hurt her," he said. "I believe you," Mrs. Lennox replied, "but that doesn't mean others won't." Julian exhaled and reached for his coat. As he left the room, he allowed himself one last glance. Beatrice had not stirred. But even in sleep, her expression had changed. The tension had eased from her brow and her lips parted in the faintest suggestion of peace. It was not love, not yet, but it was something rare, and it was no longer hidden in silence. March came draped in fog and heavy clouds, casting a grey veil over Manhattan's avenues and mansions. Spring had not yet dared to bloom, though the calendar insisted it was near. Inside the Van Alen residence, the temperature rose not with the season, but with a quiet intensity neither the staff nor its mistress dared name aloud. Julian's visits, once infrequent and unspoken, had become a rhythm as reliable as the chimes of the foyer clock. He arrived after the hour of 4, always through the servants' corridor, and was gone before darkness fully claimed the windows. Or so it had been. But as days grew longer and their rehearsals more intricate, dusk began to catch him in its amber net. It happened on a Tuesday. He had stayed longer than usual, the music holding them hostage with its unfinished phrases. Outside, the gas lamps had already begun to glow, and the wet streets reflected the light like spilled gold. As Julian stepped out through the side garden gate, carrying his satchel of scores, a passing carriage slowed. The figure inside was sharp-eyed and severe, lips pressed into a line thinner than courtesy allowed. Henry Van Alen. The wheels moved on, but the damage had been done. 2 mornings later, Henry arrived without announcement. His walking cane echoed sharply against the marble floor, announcing each step with the authority of a man who believed the world should part before him. He removed his gloves with care as he entered the drawing-room, where Beatrice waited in a silk gown of slate blue, her hands folded in her lap like a statue carved from self-control. "Your guest," he said without preamble, was seen leaving through the garden gate. Beatrice lifted her eyes. "Mr. Hart is employed by me as a composer." Henry laughed, short, bitter, humorless. "You expect me to believe that? That a widow receives a man in private after sunset for music?" His voice was not raised, but it dripped with disdain. "This is Fifth Avenue, Beatrice, not Montmartre." She did not flinch. "You presume impropriety where there is none." "No." He stepped closer, his pale eyes narrowing. "Then look at me and say it plainly. There's nothing between you and this artist?" Beatrice met his gaze without blinking. "He composes music for the spring benefit." Henry stared at her, searching her face, but it was not her words that betrayed her. It was the silence after them, the way her breath caught, the almost imperceptible tension in her jaw. Not guilt, not shame, but something far more dangerous to men like him. Conviction. He stepped back, a muscle in his temple twitching. "You dishonor Horace's name, and mine." "Horace is no longer here," she said softly, "and your name is not mine to carry." The sentence landed like a blade. Henry gathered his gloves and cane, his voice cold. "This affair will end, one way or another." He left before she could reply. That evening, as if summoned by the tension in the air, Julian arrived just as the last embers were dying in the drawing-room grate. His coat was damp from the mist outside, and there was something taut in the way he held his shoulders. He knew, or perhaps he had always known, it would come to this. Beatrice did not speak of Henry. She simply led him to the music room. There, the gas sconces had been dimmed, the room lit mostly by the fire and a single lamp on the writing desk. The shadows softened the space, blurring the boundaries between silence and sound. The piano waited, its keys reflecting the light like ivory teeth. They did not begin immediately. Instead, they sat side by side on the bench, closer than usual, their thighs nearly touching. Julian laid the new pages before them and placed his fingers on the keys. She followed. Their melody had changed. It still bore the marks of melancholy, the ache of longing restrained, but now it shimmered with a quiet urgency, as if both feared the song might be their last. They played slowly, deliberately, their hands brushing again and again as the phrases unfolded. Halfway through, Beatrice faltered. Her hand slipped, her breath caught. Julian stopped playing. She turned to him. The silence between them was no longer safe. It pulsed with everything left unsaid, with the pressure of walls too close and hours too short. Her eyes, pale and shining, searched his face, not for answers, but for permission, and he gave it. He leaned in, slowly, reverently, as though asking a question with his breath. His lips met hers, not in hunger, but in wonder, a kiss that trembled with the weight of restraint. Her hand rose to his chest, not to push him away, but to feel the rhythm of his heart beneath his coat. It was a kiss meant for silence, a kiss made not of fire but of prayer. When they parted, she did not lower her gaze, but she did speak. "You mustn't stay." "I know." He stood, his hands trembling slightly as he gathered the pages of music. She watched him, her voice low. "I've been threatened." Julian paused. "By whom?" "It doesn't matter," she said. "The question was asked, and I couldn't answer." He looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. It was not anger. It was not despair. It was understanding, deep and wordless. "Would you," he asked, "leave it all behind?" She opened her mouth, but no sound came, because the answer was not simple, because the life she had been given, the life she wore like armor, was both prison and legacy, because the house with its velvet drapes and crystal chandeliers was not only hers, it belonged to the name that built it, to the orphans she fed with its wealth, to the reputation she had protected for over a decade. Because to leave would mean more than scandal. It would mean becoming a stranger to the world that once revered her. "I don't know," she whispered. Julian nodded once, slowly, and then he left. She did not follow. She remained seated at the piano, staring at the keys they had touched together only moments before. The fire crackled behind her. The waltz lay open on the stand, unfinished. Her lips still burned with the memory of reverence. And for the first time, Beatrice Van Alen felt the true weight of choice pressing down on her heart. The study had not changed since Horace Van Alen's passing. Time, it seemed, had chosen to respect his memory with a reverence more suffocating than sacred. The walls remained lined with rows of dark mahogany shelves, crowded with ledgers, correspondence, and forgotten contracts. The heavy drapes, perpetually drawn, filtered the outside world into a wash of grey. The scent of aged paper and tobacco clung stubbornly to the upholstered armchairs and the enormous oak desk that still bore the engraved brass plate bearing his name. Beatrice rarely entered that room. It belonged to a part of her life encased in silence, in duty. She had fulfilled her role, as wife, as widow, with a devotion society applauded and privately demanded. But now, summoned by Henry's insistence and the growing sense of encroachment around her, she stepped across the threshold, her chin high, though her breath caught at the scent that greeted her like a ghost. Henry stood at the window, arms crossed behind his back, his gaze fixed on the courtyard below. His silhouette stiff and imposing in his grey three-piece suit blended with the shadows that clung to the corners. He did not turn when she entered. "I imagine you know why I called for you," he said, his voice like the scrape of metal across stone. Beatrice closed the door behind her. "I presume it is not to admire the weather." He turned then, slowly, as if to prolong the weight of the moment. His pale blue eyes held no warmth. "You are endangering everything Horace built, everything we built. This name, our name, carries a legacy that cannot be tarnished by scandal and sentiment." She crossed the room with quiet steps and stood beside the desk. "You mistake sentiment for corruption, Henry. You mistake music for rebellion." "I mistake nothing," he snapped. "You've been seen. Rumors are already spreading through parlors and clubrooms, and I am the one they look to for answers. What am I to say when your behavior casts a shadow over every donation, every negotiation, every name attached to the Van Alen Foundation?" Beatrice's expression did not waver, but her hands gripped the edge of the desk. "Then let them talk." Henry stepped closer. You forget what is at stake. You forget the orphanage, the hospitals, the very institutions you pretend to care for. Her breath caught. I don't pretend, she said, her voice trembling with restrained fire. I have given my time, my name, my heart to those children. Then consider this, he said, and opened the drawer behind him. From it he drew a single piece of parchment, the family ledger. He laid it flat before her and tapped his finger over one line, the annual allocation for the St. Martha Orphanage of Manhattan. I can end this funding with a signature. Beatrice stared at the paper, her heartbeat roaring in her ears. You wouldn't. I will, he said. Unless you put an end to your involvement with this pianist immediately, publicly and permanently. She turned away from the desk, her steps taking her to the fireplace. There, in the mirror above the mantel, her own reflection met her, pale, elegant, guarded, a woman carved by grief, by expectation. But beneath it now was something else, something unspoken that had begun to rise, a resistance. She did not speak again. Henry replaced the ledger in the drawer and straightened his cuffs. You have until the end of the week. He left the room, and with him went the last illusion of protection. That night Julian returned. She met him not in the music room but in the foyer, where the chandelier flickered above them like a star burning out. Her face held no mask. We have to talk. He followed her upstairs, past portraits of men who had signed treaties and built railroads, through corridors that whispered of rules and reputations. In her private rooms, surrounded by lilac silk and the scent of rosewater, she told him everything. He listened in silence, his expression unreadable, and when she finished, his voice was steady. Come with me. She looked at him. I mean it, he said. Come with me. Leave this city, this house, this life they've chosen for you. I don't have fortunes. I don't have legacies. But I have enough to begin. We can go north or west, or wherever you wish, as long as it's away from all of this. Beatrice walked slowly to the wardrobe. She opened it and ran her hand over the rows of gowns, satin, velvet, silk, each one a memory, a prison, a shield. She began to pack. With trembling hands, she removed a wool coat, a pair of sturdy gloves, and 2 walking dresses, simple and practical. She folded them carefully, not rushing, not speaking. Julian stood at the window, watching the snow fall beyond the glass. But as she reached for the jewelry box on her vanity, her fingers paused. Inside lay the wedding band. It was thin, worn smooth from years of wear, but still gold, still binding. She held it in her palm, and something in her chest twisted. Her eyes drifted to the letters in the box beneath it, correspondence from the orphanage matron. Among them was one written only a week prior. She opened it and read the familiar hand. We received the winter coats yesterday. The children send their thanks. They ask about the lady in grey. I told them she never forgets. Her vision blurred. Behind her, Julian approached slowly. What is it? She turned, tears not yet shed clinging to her lashes. They need me. I need you, he said quietly. She looked into his eyes, warm, honest, patient, and for a moment she wanted to surrender, to fall into the quiet promise of a simpler life, but she was no longer a woman who could choose only for herself. I need time, he nodded, not because he agreed, but because he understood the difference between love and possession. He kissed her forehead gently, reverently, and left. She remained alone in the room, surrounded by half-packed trunks, by memories, by the ghosts of names she could not abandon. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and Beatrice, torn between the man who offered her freedom and the world that demanded her silence, pressed the wedding band to her chest and wept. The storm did not come with wind or snow, but with ink. It arrived folded in the creases of the Evening Register, delivered as it always was, wrapped in twine and laid upon a silver tray by the front door of the Van Alen mansion. That morning, Mrs. Lennox was the first to retrieve it. She did not cry out, nor did she gasp. She only stood still, her eyes narrowing as she read the headline printed in bold, unforgiving type. A Widow's Waltz, played after hours. Fifth Avenue's most elegant name, entwined in whispered notes and scandalous harmonies. The article was artfully vague, but devastating in its precision. It named no one directly, yet described enough. The language danced carefully around facts, but left little to interpretation. A wealthy widow known for her philanthropy, recently rumoured to receive the company of a lesser-born musician in the private hours of evening, was said to be composing more than charitable melodies behind closed doors. By noon, the story had spilled into every drawing room from Madison Square to Gramercy Park. Fans fluttered nervously, teacups rattled against saucers, and every mention of music was now laced with innuendo. Invitations once offered freely to Beatrice Van Alen were suddenly rescinded with apologies as delicate as lace and twice as cutting. At the piano, where her fingers had once sought comfort in chords, Beatrice now sat in stillness. The room felt different, though nothing had changed. The same rose wallpaper, the same soft light filtering through sheer curtains. But now the air carried weight, as though every cushion and curtain had learned to whisper. Julian had not returned since the last conversation. She did not blame him. She had asked for time, and the city had stolen it from them. Later that day, Clara Dempsey knocked at the door of Beatrice's private sitting room. Her cheeks were flushed, her hands twisted in the folds of her apron. "Madam," she said softly, eyes lowered, "may I speak?" Beatrice looked up. Her expression was unreadable, her poise unshaken, but something fragile shimmered just beneath the surface. Clara stepped forward, her voice trembling. I believe I might have said something I should not have." Beatrice set her teacup down without sound. "To whom?" "A maid," Clara whispered. "At the Pembrokes. She's new, and She asked about Mr. Hart, about his visits. I didn't know it would matter. I only said he was kind, that you played together." A long silence followed. Beatrice rose and crossed the room slowly, her skirts brushing the carpet like the soft sweep of dusk. She placed a hand gently on Clara's shoulder. "It matters, Clara," she said with quiet gravity, "because kindness is the most dangerous truth of all." That evening she found herself in her husband's study once more. Not because she wished to remember him, but because it was the only place in the house that still offered privacy. The room had always kept secrets. Tonight, she needed it to hold one more. She sat at the desk and took a sheet of parchment. She wrote a letter, one that would be read not by society, not by the press, but by Julian, if he chose to receive it, if he had not already turned from her entirely. But before she could seal it, a knock came. It was Henry. He entered with the smooth entitlement of a man who assumed the room was his by inheritance. His cravat was crisp, his gloves immaculate, and the air around him tinged with triumph. "I warned you," he said, not waiting for her invitation. "Now the consequences unfold." Beatrice remained seated, her posture regal. "And now," she asked, "do you expect me to beg?" "No," he replied coldly. "I expect you to correct what can still be salvaged." She looked down at the letter in her hand, then back at him. "How much do you intend to erase before I'm suitable again, Henry? My music, my voice, my heart?" He stepped closer. "What you do in private may be yours, Beatrice, but what the world believes, that belongs to the family name." She stood, fire rising in her eyes. "You do not own my soul." "No," he said, "but I own the perception of it." The door closed behind him with a finality that felt more like a verdict than a departure. By the following morning, a quiet decision had been made, not in desperation, but in sacrifice. A public letter was delivered to the Evening Register, written with Beatrice's signature, carefully worded and ironclad in civility. Mr. Julian Hart's role in the Van Alen residence has been purely artistic and professional. Any insinuation to the contrary is unfounded and regrettable. It was not untrue, but it was far from honest. When the letter was printed, society sighed with relief, the kind that signaled the end of entertainment, not the restoration of truth. Gossip pivoted toward new prey, and Beatrice was quietly reabsorbed into the ranks of respectability. But the cost had been exacted. Julian disappeared. There was no message, no final visit, only absence, sharp and echoing like a room suddenly devoid of music. Rumors floated that he had left for Boston. Others said Philadelphia. None could confirm. No one truly cared, not now that the scandal had passed. But Beatrice cared. Each morning she sat at the piano alone. The unfinished waltz still rested on the stand, untouched. The ink had faded slightly from the pages where their hands had once met. The room, once warm with breath and firelight, now bore the chill of winter's return, not outside, but within. Mrs. Lennox did not speak of it. Clara moved through her duties with silent guilt, and Beatrice moved through her days like a woman composed of frost and porcelain. She attended her functions, she hosted her luncheons. Her name was once again spoken with admiration, but never with warmth, never with music. And so the Van Alen mansion remained beautiful, impeccable, untouched. But in every mirror, in every reflection, Beatrice saw not the scandal the world had feared, but the love it had destroyed. And in that silence, she was no longer numb. She was awake, and she was alone. The clocks within the Van Alen mansion ticked on, but time had become indistinguishable from silence. Weeks passed like vapor, dissolving into the velvet drapery and parquet floors. The city outside stirred toward spring, but inside the house, winter remained, not in temperature but in spirit. Beatrice Van Alen moved through her days with the practiced grace of someone performing a role she had long ceased to believe in. Her gowns were still tailored to perfection, her hair still pinned in elegant coils, her manners still impeccable. But her eyes, once reflective of restrained dignity, had grown hollow, as if they no longer belonged to a woman, but to a portrait on a wall. She no longer played the piano. The waltz, unfinished and untitled, remained on the stand, its pages untouched. Servants dusted around it carefully, as if disturbing it might shatter something far more fragile than ink and parchment. When invitations arrived, she declined them all. When she was spoken to, she answered with warmth carefully measured, like sugar weighed on a scale. But when she was alone, she was not composed. She was ash. The one place she still visited with purpose was the orphanage. The halls were noisy, the children unruly, the walls cracked and in need of paint. But it was there that Beatrice felt something human stir beneath the layers of self-protection. She wore simpler gowns for these visits, ones without pearls or corsets, and she often brought baskets of preserves and storybooks from her own childhood. It was on one such visit that the moment happened, a small, unremarkable instant that tore the air from her lungs. She had stepped into the playroom, greeted by a flurry of laughter and little feet running in all directions. In the far corner, on a wobbly stool beside a battered toy piano, sat a girl no older than 6. Her fingers, grubby and earnest, pressed the toy keys with a fumbling rhythm. She paused, started again, frowned, and tried once more. Beatrice froze. The notes, though off-key and childishly played, were unmistakable. It was the waltz, their waltz, the melody that had been born of glances, of silences, of breath held between phrases, the melody that had never been played in concert halls or printed in journals. And yet here it was, broken and stumbling, echoing from the fingers of a child with no name for it. She crossed the room slowly. "Where did you learn that?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The girl looked up. "From the tall man with the sad eyes. He came before Christmas. He played it for us, I remembered." Beatrice closed her eyes. She could see it. Julian seated at the toy piano, his hands coaxing beauty from ruin, his heart too full for bitterness. He had left part of himself behind. She returned home and wept, not in her chambers, but in the music room, seated at the very bench where they had once touched fingers in passing. Her tears fell not for reputation or regret, but for everything she had not said, everything she had tried to protect, and the cost of that silence. Mrs. Lennox found her there hours later. Without a word, the housekeeper sat beside her and placed a shawl over her shoulders. "Forgive me," Beatrice whispered. "I thought if I kept him safe I could keep myself." Mrs. Lennox placed a hand over hers. "Safety is not the same as love." 2 mornings later, a visitor arrived. He did not announce himself with cards or calling bells. Instead, he was shown into the drawing room by a hesitant Clara, who described him as a gentleman from Boston, with musical inclinations and no patience for formalities. Beatrice entered to find a man in his early 40s standing by the window, examining a small ivory sculpture with the detachment of someone used to better. "Mrs. Van Alen," he said, turning. "I'm Frederick Pembroke, composer, occasional friend to reckless pianists." Beatrice tilted her head. "You know Julian?" "I do. Knew him before he could afford shoes that matched." She said nothing. He softened. "He's in Boston, for now, but he's leaving. There's a steamer bound for Lisbon at month's end, and he's booked passage." Her breath caught, but she did not show it. Pembroke continued. "He doesn't know I'm here. He'd probably throttle me if he did. But I thought you might want to know." Beatrice moved to the fireplace, her hands resting lightly on the mantel. "Does he expect anything from me?" "No," Pembroke said, "but I think he's still waiting." "Waiting for what?" Pembroke shrugged. "A sign, a word, a note. Anything that says you chose something other than fear." She turned to him. "I gave up everything to keep him from being destroyed." "And now?" he asked. "Now that you're still here, and he's gone, and your name is spotless, what do you have?" The silence answered for her. He placed a card on the table beside the sofa. "The ship sails on the 31st. He left without another word. That night, Beatrice did not sleep. She wandered the mansion as if seeing it for the first time. The hallways, the chandeliers, the portraits of men who had never asked her opinion but demanded her allegiance. The rooms were beautiful, but beauty had become the currency of her prison. By dawn, the decision had taken root. Not impulsive, not romantic, inevitable. She summoned Mrs. Lennox and Clara. "We are to host one more gala," she said, "one final evening." Clara blinked. But madam, after everything—" Beatrice's voice was calm, almost serene. "Let them watch." Preparations began with the urgency of a ship bracing for a storm. Servants dusted candelabras that had not seen light in years. The best china was retrieved from the cellar. Invitations were dispatched by hand, not to the safe and friendly, but to those most eager to whisper. Curiosity would guarantee their attendance. In the music room, the fire burned once more. The piano was tuned. The waltz was laid upon the stand, but Beatrice did not play it, not yet. Instead, she sat beside it, staring at the sheet music until every note was committed to memory. It would not be performed by accident. It would be a reckoning, and in the silence that followed her decision, the ashes of what had been began to shift. Not toward ruin, but toward rebirth. The invitations had gone out in silence. No explanations, no apologies, no promises of entertainment or charitable cause. Just a simple cream-colored card, engraved in navy ink and sealed with the Van Alen crest. It read, "Mrs. Beatrice Van Alen requests the honor of your presence at an evening gathering at her Fifth Avenue residence. Midnight performance to conclude." There was no mention of the spring benefit, no list of patrons, no details of program or purpose. And yet, by the time the gas lamps were lit along the avenue and the moon rose above the icy rooftops of Manhattan, the street outside the Van Alen mansion was once again lined with carriages. The curious came cloaked in velvet and silk, whispering behind gloved hands, each one wondering if the rumors they had indulged in all winter would finally play themselves out, not in gossip, but in plain view. Inside the house, the atmosphere was unlike any that had come before. The chandeliers glowed, but more softly, their crystal droplets trembling with flickers of firelight. The ballroom had been prepared with care, but not extravagance. There were no floral towers, no garlands of roses, no gilded centerpieces. Only candles, hundreds of them, casting long shadows along the walls as if the very house had drawn breath. Servants moved silently. Trays of champagne passed from hand to hand with the caution of those who had been warned not to speak. Conversation was hushed, speculative. The room held the energy of a theatre moments before the curtain rises, expectation laced with something sharper. Anticipation, dread. At precisely 11:45, the doors at the top of the grand staircase opened, and she appeared. Beatrice descended slowly, each step measured, her sapphire gown cascading around her like a ripple of midnight water. It was the same dress, or nearly the same, she had worn the night Julian first played. But now it bore no veil of mourning. Her gloves were cream, not grey, her hair was looser, her diamonds absent. In their place, a single pearl pin gleamed beneath the soft fall of auburn. She held no fan, no escort. Her expression was calm, but not indifferent, composed but not cold. She was not a widow tonight, she was a woman who had chosen. The crowd parted as she reached the base of the stairs. She moved through them without hesitation, offering no smile, no acknowledgement of the startled faces that turned toward her. She passed the orchestra, silent, unused, and entered the music room. There, the grand piano had been turned to face the wide archway, positioned like an altar beneath the chandelier. The fire crackled behind it, and beside the bench rested the pages of the waltz, unnamed, unclaimed, waiting. Beatrice stood before it. The room hushed further, if such a thing was possible. Some guests craned their necks, others lowered their eyes, unsure whether they were witnesses or intruders. Then, from the far end of the hallway, footsteps, firm, unhurried. Julian Hart entered without pretense. He wore no tails, no starched cravat, only a black suit, clean and simple, his collar open at the throat. His face was solemn, his posture unbowed. He did not glance at the crowd. His eyes were for her. He approached the piano, nodded once to Beatrice, not in greeting, but in reverence, and took his seat. A pause. Then he began to play. The opening notes were low, hesitant, like a breath drawn in darkness. The melody unfolded not with bravado, but with memory of every silence they had shared, every glance stolen beneath candlelight, every word they had dared not speak. The waltz moved with grace and ache, rising and falling like a heartbeat slowed by restraint. And then, midway through, Beatrice stepped forward. Her heels barely made a sound on the polished floor, but the motion was a thunderclap. She crossed the space between them and stood beside the piano. Julian's hands continued, unwavering. She reached out, and with a tenderness that stopped the air in every guest's lungs, she placed her hand gently over his. He did not falter. They played the final measures together, his fingers guiding hers, her touch soft but certain. The harmony was imperfect. One note slightly delayed, one breath slightly rushed, but it was whole. It was theirs, and when the last chord faded into the silence, the room remained still, for a heartbeat. Then whispers, sharp, startled, reverent, rose like wind through dry leaves. Some were scandalized, others moved beyond words. Henry Van Alen stood near the rear wall, his expression carved from stone. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, with a precision that felt almost rehearsed, he turned and left, his coat sweeping behind him like a closing curtain. Beatrice did not watch him go. She remained beside Julian, her hand still resting lightly on his, as if anchoring herself to something real in a world that had always preferred illusions. Their eyes met. No one spoke to them. No one dared. They had not made a speech. They had not confessed a romance. But in that room, among silver candlesticks and unspoken rules, they had declared the one thing that mattered. The music had never been a scandal. It had always been a promise, and she had kept it. Beatrice lifted her hand from his, and he stood. He offered his arm, and for the first time in her life, in front of everyone who had once believed they owned her story, she took it without hesitation. They walked together into the hall, not to flee, not to explain, but to breathe. Behind them, the murmurs continued, but none of it reached them. The music had ended, but something far more important had begun. The snow lingered longer that year, as if reluctant to loosen its grip on a city that had witnessed something too raw, too beautiful, to forget. On Fifth Avenue, the frost still etched lace-like patterns on the windows of brownstones and gilded mansions. The wind had softened, but not yet surrendered. And inside the Van Alen residence, the fire burned steadily, though the woman who now sat beside it had no need to chase away the cold. Beatrice Van Alen no longer attended luncheons. She no longer received floral invitations etched in gold leaf, nor did she return borrowed jewels to Tiffany's for the spring season. Her name had vanished from the society columns, replaced by newer scandals, younger faces, safer marriages. The whispers had quieted, not out of forgiveness, but out of exhaustion. The world had turned, and the weight of its disapproval had failed to crush her. She had become, in the eyes of those who once revered her, untouchable, not because of privilege, but because of choice. And yet life continued. The gas lamps were lit each evening, the coal was delivered, the parlour was dusted. The silence in the house was no longer suffocating, it was deliberate, almost sacred. On her writing desk, a small stack of envelopes had begun to form. Each bore only initials, C.R. M.B.S.W., names never fully revealed, from benefactors never formally acknowledged. Inside were modest checks, folded notes, or hand-penned verses. Some arrived with pressed violets, others with nothing more than a line or two. For the children who still have time to dream, for the one who dared to waltz. The orphanage had more firewood this season. The kitchen replaced its broken stove. A new reading corner appeared in the girls' dormitory, funded not by society's approval, but by something quieter and more enduring. Mrs. Lennox, ever faithful, continued her work with the efficiency of a woman who had long stopped being surprised by the tides of the world. But now, on occasion, she lingered in the hallway to listen to the creak of piano keys beneath the widow's fingers. And though she never said it aloud, she smiled more often. Clara, the maid, walked more carefully. She spoke less, worked harder, and never again opened the music room door without knocking. Julian had not returned, not in letters, not in whispers, not in person. But his absence no longer felt like loss. It felt like breath held in a cathedral, quiet, reverent, waiting. Beatrice moved differently now. Her hands no longer trembled when she opened the curtains each morning. Her posture no longer curled beneath invisible burdens. She wore no corset most days, no pins in her hair. Only wool shawls and soft gloves, and on occasion the pearl comb he once admired. One morning near the end of March, a letter arrived. It was simple, unmarked by insignia or wax. The envelope was thin and beige, as if it had travelled far and through many hands. Mrs. Lennox brought it to her personally, a glint in her eye betraying her curiosity. Beatrice opened it slowly. Inside was a concert ticket. Vienna, Musikverein, a spring recital scheduled in 3 weeks' time. And beneath it, written in a hand she would recognize anywhere, a single line, "Your seat is beside the piano." She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply folded the paper once more and held it against her chest for a long time, as if the warmth of her body might carry it further than any ship ever could. The next days passed with a quiet urgency. She did not announce her plans. There were no trunks lined in brocade, no ladies' maids bustling through the corridors. Only one small case rested by her bed, into which she placed the concert ticket, the sheet music of the waltz, now titled in her own hand, and a blue velvet glove, the mate of which had never been found. She left the house one final time on a grey morning when the sky threatened neither storm nor sun. The driver, a young man with freckles and a respectful silence, helped her into the carriage without question. As they moved through the city, Beatrice saw the signs of winter breaking. Shopkeepers aired out their windows. Boys tossed pebbles at melting puddles. A young woman in a lavender shawl passed by, holding a bouquet of yellow crocuses. When the carriage turned onto the docks, the wind caught her hair, lifting it gently like a farewell. The ship stood tall, a tower of sails and promise. Stewards moved with precision, and the scent of salt and coal filled the air. Beatrice stepped down from the carriage slowly, a gloved hand steady as she adjusted the brim of her travelling hat. It bore no veil. She climbed the gangway with no one at her side, no titles following her, no family trust to hold her in place. Only the music in her case and the words in her heart. Your seat is beside the piano. Once aboard, she found her cabin, modest, clean, facing the sea. She unpacked nothing, only opened the window and let the wind in. She stood there as the final lines were cast, as the city shrank behind her like a theatre fading behind its curtain. The bells rang, the sails lifted, the water stirred, and somewhere far ahead, not in society, not in legacy, but in sound, someone was waiting. Beatrice closed her eyes. She could almost hear it. Not applause, not gossip, music. The same notes that had once stirred beneath velvet and silence now played beneath her skin. Not with grandeur, but with gentleness. As if the waltz was no longer a question, but a vow. And in her stillness, in that breathless moment between leaving and arriving, she smiled. Outside the window, the first snow began to melt. Epilogue. 5 years later. The year was 1886, and Vienna had bloomed into spring, with its usual riot of lilacs and golden light. The Musikverein, now familiar and warm to her, no longer made Beatrice Van Alen feel like an imposter. She sat in the same reserved seat, just beside the piano, where 5 years earlier she had first watched Julian take the stage not as a guest, but as a name the world now spoke with reverence. Tonight, the hall was full once more. A hush fell over the crowd as Julian Hart walked toward the instrument. His gait was steadier now, touched by time and acclaim, but his expression bore the same quiet intensity, the eyes of a man who once crossed a continent, not for fame, but for love. Beatrice no longer wore mourning colours. That night, she was dressed in a soft grey silk, trimmed in ivory lace, her hair streaked with silver and swept into a low twist, revealing the pearl comb she had once tucked away in grief. She wore no gloves. The audience only saw the celebrated pianist and the widow from New York, whose story had long since faded from scandal into legend, a tale that had inspired a symphony, a ballet, and even a stage play in Paris. But no one truly knew what had become of them after the last note echoed in that Manhattan ballroom years ago. They had not married, they had not returned, they had simply continued. After that unforgettable gala, Julian left again, this time with her blessing and with a promise that bore no timeline, only faith. Beatrice remained in New York long enough to secure the future of the orphanage, dissolve what was left of the family estate, and say farewell to the ghosts of Fifth Avenue. Then she disappeared from society's view, boarding a ship not as a widow nor as a fallen socialite, but as a woman walking toward the life she had chosen. They lived simply, in Vienna, then in Milan, later Paris. Julian played in salons, then concert halls, then royal theatres. Beatrice wrote music reviews under a pseudonym for a Berlin journal, took up watercolour painting, and helped a group of young girls open a music school in the outskirts of Florence. Her days were quiet, filled with books, music, and sunlit mornings spent tending geraniums they loved without ceremony, without vows, without a house full of servants or silver trays. Their intimacy lived in rituals, tea shared before rehearsals, letters left on the nightstand, walks by the Danube with silence stretching comfortably between them. The world changed, slowly. Names that once held power in New York faded. The Van Alen name dissolved into memory. Henry, bitter and alone, passed away without ceremony, leaving behind nothing but ledgers and an oil portrait no museum would accept. The orphanage, now under new leadership, bore a plaque at its entrance that read, "Founded in love, maintained by dignity." Clara, who once whispered truths to careless maids, now worked as a headmistress in the Bronx, her mistakes long forgiven, her heart wiser. And Mrs. Lennox, dear sharp-eyed Mrs. Lennox, received postcards every month until her death, each one ending with the same sentence, "There is music here, and I am well." Back in the music verein, as Julian sat before the grand piano, he turned to the woman seated beside it, not for approval, not for reassurance, but for something more intimate, grounding. She gave him the smallest of nods, and then he played. The piece was new, but woven with themes familiar to anyone who had followed his music, motifs of longing, of defiance, of a waltz that once defied a city. The melody rose and fell like breath, like memory, like love that had bent with time, but never broken. When the final note rang out, the applause surged through the hall like thunder. People rose to their feet, flowers were thrown, cheers echoed. But Beatrice remained seated. Her eyes glistened, not with regret or nostalgia, but with quiet awe, the kind reserved for miracles one is lucky enough to witness twice. Julian stood, bowed once, and instead of turning to the crowd, extended his hand to her. She took it. And though the world would remember his music, the critics would review his phrasing, and the students would imitate his style, the truth of Julian Hart's greatest masterpiece stood silently at his side. Her fingers curled into his, her eyes still soft after all these years. They had lost everything to find each other. And 5 years later, the music still played. Every story leaves an echo and a waltz. After Midnight leaves one that lingers deep in the soul. It's a tale of courage dressed in silk, of love born not from perfection, but from the quiet bravery of choosing what feels right, even when the world says it's wrong. Beatrice and Julian taught us that sometimes the most powerful revolutions happen not in grand speeches or fireworks, but in a single glance, a shared melody, a hand extended in silence. Their love was not loud, but it endured. This story is a gentle reminder that healing is not the same as forgetting, and that the heart, no matter how broken, can find a new rhythm. That we are never too old, too ruined, or too bound by duty to choose tenderness again. If this story moved you, if you held your breath in the candlelight of that ballroom, or saw yourself in the hush of that final piano note, we invite you to tell us what it meant to you. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you made it all the way to the epilogue, write the word waltz, so we'll know you were there when the snow finally melted. Your presence, your time, and your heart mean the world to us. If you feel called to support the team that brings these timeless romances to life, you can send a super thanks on YouTube in whatever amount feels right for you. It helps us continue crafting these stories with care and soul. But if you're not able to give in that way, you can still make a beautiful difference by sharing this video with a friend who needs a little hope, or watching more of the love stories we've left for you in the cards above. Because love, real love, is never truly gone. It just waits for us, like music after midnight.